Well, good morning. Good to see you all. Good to see those on Zoom. We're continuing with our series on Sermon on the Mount. You'll never guess, this is number 8. And I think we got 17 or 18 in this series, and I will be finishing at the end of July. However, there are gaps, so you won't be having it all the time. But we have blocks of teaching on the Sermon on the Mount as we go through step by step. Let's have the scene up on the screen. Just to remind you of this extraordinary scene in Jesus' ministry. He's been incredibly successful preaching around Galilee, has gathered a group of disciples, has performed hundreds of extraordinary miracles and taught in all the synagogues. And just prior to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes a very strategic decision. He decides amongst all his followers, he's going to appoint 12 men and call them apostles. And they're going to be his foundation team. He's going to build the whole church on these 12 men. And he's up on a mountainside when he appoints them. And this is the same event. Immediately following, he starts teaching. He's starting to build his discipleship community, saying this is what the community is going to be like. And those of you who've heard me speak already in the previous episodes will remember this theme. He's building the church community. So on the hillside there in Galilee, just overlooking the Sea of Galilee, we have first of all the 12 apostles. Secondly, we have a group of disciples, people who've committed themselves to following Jesus. Thirdly, we have a crowd of people who are fascinated by Jesus and they follow him around wherever he is. And fourthly, we have some officials from Jerusalem, some Pharisees and others who are watching what is going on. And so Jesus teaches. And we have this incredible Sermon on the Mount. He starts with attitudes, the Beatitudes. He then explains the relationship between his teaching and the law of Moses, saying this is something different. It's going to be linked to the law of Moses, but the law of Moses is going. It's the past era. It's the Jewish era. Now in the church era, my teaching is going to be the foundation for the discipleship community. And then as we've been following through chapter 5, and we're well into that process now, we've been looking at particular topics that Jesus speaks about. Anger, sexual lust, the conduct of marriage, what we promise to other people and the oaths we swear, which we looked at last week. And now we come in these last two talks in chapter 5 to some incredibly challenging territory of Jesus' teaching. So challenging that preachers generally avoid engaging with these texts in a careful way. We can't afford to do that with any of Jesus' teaching. And as soon as I read the text to you, you'll immediately recognize it if you have any familiarity with the Bible. And you'll also immediately realize why this is a very difficult text. It turns out that Jesus is creating a far more radical community than anybody initially believed. They thought he was just a wonder worker and someone who was going to set them free from all their social problems and give them enough to eat and set them free from all their illnesses. But it turns out he's forming a robust and a strong community, which later on he'll call the church. He hasn't used that word yet. And that this community is not just going to sit there in Galilee or sit there in Israel. It's going to be transferred from country to country, from nation to nation, and it's this community that's going to change the world over the centuries. And this community is built on, amongst other things, the Sermon on the Mount. This is a rock upon which we build our values. And when we compromise our values away from the values of the Sermon on the Mount and other similar teachings, the church gets weaker, and its influence diminishes, and sometimes it fades away altogether. The stakes are high, but the journey is incredibly exciting. So many people want to be part of something radical, don't they? Well, you don't need to look much further than the Sermon on the Mount if you want a radical lifestyle, a risky lifestyle, an exciting lifestyle, a challenging lifestyle, but also a costly one. And so we read our text for today, coming up on the screen. You've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Maybe you can see why preachers get a little bit nervous when this text comes up. How are we going to understand this extraordinary text? First of all, we need to understand the eye for an eye and the tooth for a tooth. Before we go anywhere, we need to work out what Jesus was talking about here. He's referring back to the Jewish law of Moses. The law that the Jews understood and enacted very well. And in 3 different places, in 3 different circumstances of this law, it is instructed that the law courts in Israel, note, not individuals, the law courts should exact retribution on people who end up fighting, attacking people physically, injuring them, or even killing them. Notably, Leviticus 24, verse 19, as an example, anyone who injures his neighbor is to be injured in the same manner, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and the one who's inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. This sounds tremendously harsh, doesn't it? The law courts can say that if I have a fight with you and I break your arm in that fight, that the courts can instruct that my arm is broken. If I hit you in the eye and blind you in the right eye, the court can instruct that my right eye be blinded by judicial action, not by private vengeance. Wow. That seems harsh, doesn't it? Why? To prevent vendettas. In all societies, notably tribal societies or where the rule of law is very weak, society very quickly degenerates into acts of vengeance. In parts of Italy where the rule of law is limited, notably Corsica and Sicily and other places, the mafia still to this day operate on the eye for an eye principle. If somebody is killed in one family that's associated with one group of the mafia, they immediately think we'll kill somebody in the other group. And then the other group said, right, we'll kidnap somebody. And then they'll kidnap two people, and the whole thing escalates into a tremendous conflict. This happens in many different societies to this day. In Rwanda in the 1990s, there was a tribal conflict between the two main tribes, the Tutsi and the Hutu tribes. And when the rule of law broke down through civil war and various other things that took place, the Hutu took revenge on the Tutsi when the law had been overturned and there was no real control of civic law, and within a period of some few weeks, more than 500,000 people had been killed. The Rwanda genocide. This is the kind of outcome of the vendetta culture that easily happens in any society, especially when the rule of law is weak. Now, by the time of Jesus, they used fines rather than physical punishments in the Jewish courts at the time when Jesus was speaking. But Jesus says, okay, that's what they've done in Jewish society through the law. But now you, my disciples, when people are malicious against you because of your faith, note, this is not about robbery or stealing things, civil law and all that kind of thing. This is because of your faith. The context is because of your faith. This is the context of the whole Sermon on the Mount. And we'll set the context again for you by a reference to an earlier part of the chapter in just a moment. When people start attacking you because of your faith, Jesus is basically saying, don't look for the retribution of the law court. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Don't resist that person in that way. You've got to trust God to defend you in a way that's entirely counterintuitive to the natural instincts of humanity, which is we're going to defend ourselves. This is hard. Do not resist an evil person. Jesus is speaking to the tendency of humans to want to retaliate. That's how we feel naturally. When our rights are invaded, our property is stolen, our honor is besmirched by somebody else, we want to go into the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth culture. That's how humanity is generally wired. And so Jesus is making an incredibly tough demand here. What it actually means in practice, I'll explain as we go along. But this is a situation where he was anticipating, and this is really important for the context, that the Christian community would have no legal protection. We think, well, if something like that happens, we just go to the law courts. You go to the police, you report an incident to the police. Certain legal provisions we've put in place to protect you, and that is good. But he was anticipating and speaking into a situation where that was not the case for the early disciples. They were undefended by the legal system. And this is exactly what happened to Jesus himself. He predicted persecution. Verse 11 of the same chapter, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you, say all falsely all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. He's predicting that the church will enter a phase where it won't have any legal protection when it starts out on its journey after the day of Pentecost. How are we going to deal with it when the courts are not on our side? And that's exactly what happened to Jesus when he was brought before the Sanhedrin. and brought before the Jewish ruling authorities in a show trial, a mock trial, an illegal trial in the middle of the night on that Thursday evening before Good Friday. And he was brought initially to the father-in-law of the high priest, a man called Annas, into an informal trial. And according to John's account of it, while this was taking place, somebody slapped him across the face. They insulted him in exactly the same way that he's describing here. They smacked him on the cheek. That's the situation that Jesus is anticipating. And he didn't retaliate. It's interesting later on in the story of the church, when people had the law on their side, the church, they could use it. And this actually happened to Paul on one occasion. He was in prison for 2 years by the Roman governor in the city of Caesarea towards the end of his ministry. They couldn't decide what to do with him. They were hesitating and prevaricating over what to do with Paul. One governor left and another governor came and nothing really happened, and Paul got fed up with the situation. He said, look, I appeal to Caesar. What he meant is this. He had the legal right to say, I'm not going to be tried in this court. I'm going to be tried in the imperial court in Rome because I am a Roman citizen. He was one of the few people who had this privileged status. And he used the law in his favor. And that's the situation that we tend to think about in the West when we think of Christian persecution or things like this. Let's use the law in our favor. That's exactly what Paul did. But Jesus is speaking into a situation here in the Sermon on the Mount where that is not possible. And that's the contextual thing that helps us to understand what he's saying. And in the early days, the church was always under pressure because it did not have the defense of the legal situation, either in Israel when it was working there, or in the Roman Empire, in other parts of the Roman Empire under the Roman legal system there. And so Jesus describes 4 circumstances here. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Don't retaliate when insulted for your faith. That's hard. But that's what Jesus did at his trial. He didn't retaliate when he was insulted. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. This is a reference to using the law courts against the church. And that's what happened in those early days because they didn't have any legal status. The Romans recognized certain religions as having legal protections in the Roman Empire. Judaism was one of them. It was a legalized religion. The Jews were allowed to have their synagogues and worship in their way, and they were relatively well protected. But when the Christians came along, they had no legal status whatsoever. In fact, the Romans didn't know what they were. They couldn't work out because they said, well, every religion has a statue and a God, but you don't have a statue of Jesus anywhere. We worship the invisible God. They found that a complete mystery. They had no legal status. And so Jesus is predicting a time when lawsuits will be used against the church. And he said, you can't defend yourself in the law in that situation. You'll just have to let the law unjustly take things from you, take your freedom from you, take even your possessions from you. And that's exactly what happens in the New Testament. We have an example of it, often not noticed. The Hebrews, the congregation that the writer writes to in the book of Hebrews, were Jewish believers in Jesus who'd suffered some significant persecution. And in Hebrews 10, verse 32, it says, remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you endured in a great conflict, full of suffering, Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property. Their money and their homes were confiscated through the law courts because of their faith. That's what Jesus had in mind here. It's going to happen. People will use the law courts against you. You're just going to have to accept it. You accepted it because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. An unjustified lawsuit against believers. Not only that, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. The Roman army had the right anywhere in the empire to commandeer the labor of any passerby to fulfill physical tasks for them, mostly transporting things from A to B. You could just be in a crowd one day and Roman soldiers could be walking by and they say, "Hey, you come over here, and the guy next to you, and the guy next to you, want you 3 because we've got this load we need to carry for a couple of miles down the road. Off you go." Nothing you can do. Now that could easily be used against Christians, couldn't it? We actually have an example of that happening in the Gospels. I wonder whether you can remember where it was. Very interesting example. When Jesus was going to Calvary carrying his cross, because of the severe beating he'd experienced and the immense stress he was under, he was unable to carry the cross. And the Roman soldiers looked out to the crowd. "Hey, you, come over here. Carry this cross to that hill." And so a man named Simon of Cyrene was immortalized in that moment because he conducted some forced labor for the Roman authorities. He had no alternative. That was what they could do. Christian tradition has it that he became a believer. We'll find out one day. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Almost certainly a reference to people knowing that the church was a place of generosity and giving and care for the poor, and then start coming and asking money and resources from the church. And Jesus powerfully calls us to an attitude of generosity and kindness and open-heartedness, even when the motives of those people are not always good motives. This is a most profound passage. Let's update it a little bit. That's the 1st century. We live in the 21st century. We live in a society where we have a legal system that's robust and strong, and for the most part, Christians can call on the legal system to defend their rights, although that's under question in a number of different areas. It's good that we should do that. But Jesus speaks to Christian communities particularly who have little or no state protection. And this passage leads us to the conclusion that in that situation of intense vulnerability, that the church needs to express a profound faith that God will overcome evil when you can't fight it. A modern example. In 1979, there was the first Islamic revolution of the modern age in the nation of Iran. And this regime, which is still in power today, was and is utterly hostile to the Christian church in amongst Iranian people. And immediately, when this regime came to power, all foreign missionaries had to leave immediately. And only about 500 known Iranian Christians could be named amongst those who knew the country in 1979. The law was then turned against them. And some of them were imprisoned, pastors in particular, martyred. I've been in meetings in London with the wives of those pastors who were martyred and had the privilege of encountering them. The legal system was turned against them. The situation of Matthew 5, verse 38 to 42 became their lived experience in Iran. That text became a living text for them. How are we going to fight this? We can't start a resistance movement. We can't start a terror movement. We're not called to leave the country. We're just going to have to endure the injustice, and we're going to have to put our faith in God that He's going to turn this situation round. And so in 1979, we have only about 500 known believers in this massive, highly populated country of Iran. And then what did God do? Over 4 decades later, we find that many Iranians were deeply disillusioned by this oppressive Islamic regime. And an incredible spiritual thirst has arisen in the land. And there's been a faithful remnant of Iranian believers from those days when the revolution started, who planted house churches and started disseminating Bibles and praying for people in the street. And all through all those decades, despite this harsh system which is still in place to this day, the church has grown and is now estimated. And of course, it's purely an estimate because nobody can give an accurate number to this. It's impossible to get any statistics. But those 500 are at least 500,000. And there may be a lot more. Some estimate 1 million. And so we see this incredible truth here of Jesus speaking these difficult words which have been lived out for several decades by the church in this country. And we realize that when the church looks beaten, God is not contained. And His Spirit can move if those people will be faithful when the law is not protecting them. And the cost of that faithfulness may be martyrdom, imprisonment, exile, separation from families. And so texts like this, which we look at, and we're just a little bit puzzled by this, are the living bread of communities who are oppressed in the way that the Iranian church has been oppressed. A similar and even more dramatic story could be told about the Chinese church and others. Time doesn't permit. But God is greater than our own lives. And if we're called upon to suffer great injustice, that doesn't mean the gospel won't spread. It's a radical attitude of trust that we're called upon to follow. Another modern example I mentioned earlier in this series, the German Christian leader of the 1930s and 40s, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pastor in the Lutheran Church in Germany, and when the Nazis came to power, immediately realized terrible fate awaited the church and the Jewish people and the freedoms of the country. And he wrote and published in about 1937 in German a book translated into English, The Cost of Discipleship. Here is my copy here. And I just looked up what he wrote about this passage. At this point, it becomes evident that when the Christian meets injustice, he no longer clings to his rights and defends them at all costs. He's absolutely free from possessions and bound to Christ alone. The only way to overcome evil is to let it run itself to a standstill because it does not find the resistance it's looking for. 6 years later, having written that, in April 1943, when Bonhoeffer was still a free man and a pastor in the so-called confessing church, the independent church, the anti-Nazi church in Germany, he was in his mid-30s by then, a single man still, living at his parents' house in Berlin, the capital of Germany, and supporting anti-Nazi activities peacefully, supporting the confessing church pastors and their communities around the country. One day there was a knock at the door of his parents' house. They were well known in Berlin. His father had been a professor in the university. And 2 Gestapo officers stood at the door. They said, is Dietrich Bonhoeffer here? And they said, no, he's out today. Tell him we called. We'll be back to see him. He happened to be at a neighbor's house that day. And when he got back to his home, his parents' home where he lived, his parents said, the Gestapo, the German secret police, the Nazi police they want to interrogate you. And he said, let's make a meal and have a celebration meal as a family. And he decided that he wasn't going to try and flee. So they had a celebration meal as a family. There were various other members present. But he knew what was coming. And the next day, there was a knock on the door. And 2 Gestapo officers came again. Is Dietrich Bonhoeffer at home? Yes, he's at home. Please ask him to come with us and bring some possessions with him, whatever he needs. We want to question him. That was his last day of freedom. He was imprisoned in Berlin, and then subsequently moved to 2 different concentration camps, and subsequently 2 years later, 2 weeks before the end of the Second World War, executed by hanging at the order of Hitler himself, who died only 2 weeks later through suicide. So in 1937, Bonhoeffer wrote the words in this book. And in 1943, when the evil person knocked at the door, he remembered, do not resist. He had no legal rights. This wasn't the Germany of the 20s where the legal system functioned. This was the Germany of the Nazis, where the Nazis controlled everything. But he knew that it wasn't just about his life. And so the very regime that tried to destroy him itself collapsed within 2 weeks of his death. And the church was reborn in Germany. And Bonhoeffer became one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century. But he knew in his bones that the Sermon on the Mount wasn't there for the entertainment of Christians. It was there because one day we have to live out the provisions of the Sermon on the Mount. Some of those provisions we may have to live out today. Some of them we may live out in years to come. And sometimes the provisions of the Sermon on the Mount guide us to pray for and identify with our brothers and sisters in other countries who are facing existential threat to the church because they have no legal protections, in exactly the same way that Jesus anticipated the early Christian community having no legal protections, but he gave them a strategy. And he knew that this strategy would win. Because as a few give up their lives or give up their freedom or give up their possessions, give up their riches, So it is almost always that the many are drawn to the faith, and so the faith prevails. Let's have the band come up. We're going to sing the creed in a moment. As they're coming, I'd like you to stand, and I want to read back to you as a prophetic conclusion the words of 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 5 that Keith read to us. May the Lord direct your hearts into God's love, and the second bit is important, Christ's perseverance. The commitment to the long game. The Sermon on the Mount is about the long game of lifelong discipleship. And Jesus promises incredible rewards, and that his kingdom will never, ever be thwarted in those terrible times when the church has no legal protections. It will always rise again, because he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords.